Okay, so good morning to everybody. Welcome to this symposium. I'm very happy to have all of you, but particularly Dimitris Papadopoulos. I'm very happy that he agreed to join this conversation, and I'm pretty sure we will be finding very interesting points discussing his very important book and more broadly his ideas about politics, ontologies, and ecologies, because this is the framework within which we are talking now today. We are meeting today. Just two words about this framework. This I would call it a community of discussion. Was born in 2017 out of an attempt to find what people coming from different disciplines, so sociology, philosophy, anthropology, economics, political science, and so geography. What we're doing about what seemed to me a kind of evolution of the broader political ecology framework towards a growing importance of the ontological stakes, or the ontological way of doing things and conflicting and whatever. So it was a kind of curiosity. What particularly was addressed to Italian scholars working in Italy and also abroad, just to see, to connect people working on the similar things, but in different networks out of their own field of expertise or whatever. So the first meeting was quite nice, so we decided to continue. And in 2018 and 19, we had other seminars. One focused on the issue of limit, and another one focused on the issue of value. So the plan is to continue these kind of things and gradually broaden to a broader audience, also international. So this summer we had a first summer school, which was quite successful, with over 60 participants coming from many countries. And now we are launching this other initiative, that is a kind of symposium. And it's different things. We are also hoping to go on with the seminars, but this autumn, for obvious reasons, we had to give up, because we felt that it is important also to physically meet, to have a proper interaction. So we will postpone to next year, hoping for the better. And in this case, the symposium, we decided to choose Dimitris' book because we believe it is perfectly fitting the framework of POE. So this is a very good way to launch this kind of initiative. So I'm very happy, I repeat, to have you all here. And I leave the floor to Andrea, who will be chairing and steering this morning. Thank you again, Dimitris, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you to all the POE community. I moved because, I mean, for me, Dimitri is a friend, is a teacher, is a colleague, and so is a strong presence in my life, not only intellectually. And at the same time, POE has been, when I came back to Italy, a very significant place for starting thinking collectively, politics, engagement, ecologies, technoscience, and other kind of topics. So could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm moved because for me, this is a special encounter between the book of Dimitri and the community of POE. So again, thank you very much, Dimitri. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you to all the community of POE. I prepared just a couple of things more related to who maybe didn't not have yet the chance to read this fantastic book. It's 3 notes around 3 key concepts of the book: technoscience, alterontologies, and more than social movements. just a way for offering a context for this book. I think the decisive context of this book of Dimitris is the human non-human continuum culture that characterize our century, and the continuous folding of everyday life, science, and technology, something that we learn to call technoscience, that is seen from Dimitris as the main drive of the post-human culture. So this is a bit the starting point of the book, and I think that the notion of technoscience of Dimitris resonates strongly with the notion of technoscience of Donna Haraway. In fact, in Donna Haraway, technoscience designate a jump in the historical narrative, similar to the jump between medieval times, medieval European times, and modernity. And so it's a point of, it's a starting point that around the question of technoscience, there is this strong idea that not only science, technology, and everyday life merge, but also that inside this merging, there are, let's say, the modern distinction between nature and society, subject and object, the natural and artifactual is finished. But what makes, I think, also significant for our discussion of POE is that in Dimitris there is this idea that in the end of the humanistic subject, in the end of the humanistic culture, and in the centering of the human in relation to the material world, technologies, and other species, there is a strong condition of possibility supported by the desire of escaping humanity in favor of richer forms of earthly cohabitation and socio-material composition. The idea of technoscience, and this is related also with our discussion of the last year around the question of value. In Dimitris, there is the idea that technoscience determines a notion of production that has a double meaning. Production in this book is at the same time the construction of new ontologies and the insertion of them inside the scale of value. And what is called biofinancialization here is this idea that the financialization of life and matter work together, and the frontiers of productivism and the frontiers of matter merge in nature culture. Here lies, for Dimitri, the actuality of ontological politics in technoscience. In a historical time in which technoscience and the processes of biofinancialization are making words and rearticulating forms of life and forms of living and dying in nature culture, politics becomes ontological politics. And here we arrive at the second key word of this text, Alterontologies. And the idea that in this condition, emergent socio-ecological movements are reclaiming everyday materiality by actively recomposing and rearticulating it. When ontology comes to politics, autonomy is mainly about crafting everyday ways of life, alterontologies. So forms of life and modes of existence. So from my perspective, what makes irrelevant every essential distinction between human society and material worlds are often erased from what matters as politics, but this is not clearly the case of this book. And I feel that the necessity to think politics in more than human words emerging from this book comes from a demand of life experimentation that is not anymore disposed to separate justice from everyday life, human from non-human world, and action from care. In doing this, Papadopoulos captures an intensity of movements of our contemporaneity. And I think that here the notion of insurgent posthumanism is very significant also for highlighting a way of thinking, a critical way, an alternative way of thinking post-humanism. Also, this is another object. This has been another object of debate in the context of POE, and so we have a good occasion for discussing it today. And I think that this idea resonates strongly with the ontological struggles of modern social movements to create alternative material articulation, autonomous space, and communities of justice. So last key term, modern social movements. The idea of modern social movements comes from the idea that movements are changing societies practically by engaging with both the human and the non-human world in their everyday life. And in doing that, they involve some part of technoscience. If there is a formula of the book, it's this one: the metamorphosis of social movements to movement. That is, movement of matter and the social simultaneously, movements of ontology. This idea that Dimitris developed in a certain way also in his previous two books. And here I'm mentioning analyzing everyday experience, social research, and political change that Dimitris wrote with Niam Stevenson, and escape routes, control subversion in the 21st century that Dimitris wrote with Vasilis Tsianos. Experimental practice is the third book in which the remaking of everyday existence in mundane and unexpected ways is seen as the center of the processes of transformation. So we could say that if the autonomy of migrations, which is a central concept of the book of Dimitris and Vasilis Tsianos, teaches us to see movements before capital and mobility before control, something similar could be said in relation to grassroots technoscience. Everyday material justice comes before capital, and experimental practice comes before securitization. I think this is the dream, the hope, and the ethico-political desire that passes through the entire book of Dimitri. Okay, sorry, this was just a very basic introduction to the book. Dimitris is professor of science, technology, and society at the University of Nottingham. Dimitris Papadopoulos is also the director of the Institute for Science and Society, again at the University of Nottingham, and is also the founding director of Eco-Societies, one of the University of Nottingham's interdisciplinary research priority clusters. Okay, so now I think, Dimitri, you have half an hour, more or less, for your speech, and then we will have our first round of discussion with Laura Centemeri, Naomi Milner, Lara Monticelli, Roberta Raffaetà, and Luigi Pellizzoni. And then we will have another round of discussion, opening the possibility to take the word to people connected in this webinar. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'd like to share some slides, so I'll start a presentation. Just a moment too. Can you see the slide?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
I can.
thank you very much, Andrea, again, and thank you, Luigi, for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm honored for this invitation, and I very much look forward to your thoughts, to the discussion, to the conversation with Laura, Naomi, Lara, Roberta later. I'd like to use a PowerPoint presentation because I decided to prepare something quite idiosyncratic. It's a visual storytelling of main images that have been important for the book, and visual storytelling is crucial, or was a crucial part for the development of the book. But also, as I do that, I'd like to ask some questions about some of the key themes or topics of the book, and how and discuss their relevance today. So I'd like to start with the beginning of the book, and the beginning is in 2011, which is a crucial moment for social movements in European and global context. It's the peak of a period of social movement mobilization starting after the financial crisis around 2008 with the events in Athens, and going all the way to 2013, 14, perhaps even 15. And within a very wide type of social engagement, mobilization, campaigns, there was also an event that happened in Britain, and this is the 2011 England riots, as they came to be called, which were probably the most significant riots that happened in Britain since 1985, where we had the Brixton riots. And what happened there is that it was a very significant social unrest that left no trace on the way politics happened afterwards. They left no trace in rethinking the question of race. It left no trace in designing other policies, public policies. It left no trace in social consciousness. It was such an important event, and despite that, it left no trace in changing the constitution of the political in Britain. And this, unlike all the previous riots that we had in this country. And many people were struggling with this, and one of them was Paul Gilroy, who very shortly after wrote, he wrote several pieces. Actually, one of them was about an attempt to understand what is happening there. You don't need to read this longer quote, but he basically says, we need to think the way we organize and differently. So there is a question of organization here, and this became for me a crucial question. What if we need to think the way social movements organize in a different way? Not so much as a social organization, which happens anyway, but as a form of material organization, something that later became ontological organizing. And this led me to the second part of the book, which was very much related to the research I was doing at the moment. And this was on more than human and post-human culture. Now, of course, these are very broad terms. In the book, I approach it from three perspectives. First of all, technoscience, and I think Andrea described the understanding of technoscience in the book as the fusion of technology, science, and everyday life. And this can happen from very worrying visions of enclosing the natural commons all the way to community technology and grassroots technoscience. The second dimension is the decline of humanism and of white Western universalism suppressing other versions of what humans are. So this is a form of post-humanism emphasizing the decline of the humanism part of the term. And I think the third one is another side of this post-human or more than human culture, which emphasizes the post-anthropocentric conditions in which we find ourselves today. Humans are no longer in control. Probably they were never in control, but it is less about what was happening, and it is more about our understanding of it. Now, I think more and more humans, more and more of us know that we are not in control of social, environmental, material processes. And there is a quest for finding alternative ways of understanding them and engaging with them. And I think this bringing together of an open question of social organization within the social movements of this period, and the question of more than human and post-human culture are the two beginnings that the book brings together and tries to explore. Now, the first outcome of this thinking together of social movements and more than human culture is perhaps a necessity to rethink alternative histories of social movements. And there are many examples in the book. Here I want to refer only and use one of these examples to highlight this, and then a question that I have about the book for myself. This is a map of the Charnwood Forest, which is very close to where I live in the British East Midlands. It's a large area of rolling hills, 600 million year old rocks, fields, tracts of folds, and a few ancient woodlands, which are covered with dense carpets of bluebells every spring. And it is also a site of a long history of conflict over the enclosure of the local commons. This is a conflict that was quite widespread, and this is not an exception. In Britain, there cannot be a forest which did not have some dramatic episode of conflict over common rights. The very well-known historian E.P. Thompson describes the event of the conflict in Charnwood, which took place in 1749. It was a conflict over the appropriation of common lands and the forest by the local gentry for turning them into warrens, rabbit farming, which was quite widespread at this time. And the conflict ended with violent clashes between the villagers and the army of the local lords. The Charnwood Opera, which you see here, was written and performed in the forest a few years later in 1753 to commemorate these events. It is probably the only surviving example of a protest ballad against enclosure in Britain. So for more than 50 years after this conflict, the commons remained unenclosed or relatively unenclosed, and were maintained by the villagers. The act of the enclosure of Charnwood was eventually passed in 1808, So 59 years later, and transformed Charnwood Forest to fields of arable farming. After the enclosure of 1808, very few lands were remained commonly maintained, and some of them were planted with trees. These tree-covered lands make up the only woods that exist today. So far, and you can see some of them here, I took this picture a few weeks ago. So far from only a story of the conflict over common rights, this is a typical example of how place, matter, and the commons fuse into each other. The commons rarely exist in the abstract and never outside of a specific ecology. But this ecological embeddedness is not static. It is a process of co-emergence. The commoners and the commons, the land, the plants, the animals, the concrete geology, the diversity of the geology, geodiversity, the biodiversity of the place, the local common rights, all of them construct each other. And this is a way to say that we might need to think of these alternative histories of reading social movement mobilization as something that brings together more than human dimensions and ecological aspects into the way that social movements took place in certain periods. But of course, there is an open question here, and this is for our discussion later. How far can we say that social movements are more than social or ecological? Is every social move, can we reinterpret every social movement as a more than social movement? I think this was also Naomi's question to a recent text that Andrea and me are writing actually right now about more than social movements. So what is the defining moment of the more than social? Now, rethinking the more than human, more than social dimensions of social movements leads to the question of composition, which for many of us in social movements is a crucial question. I'm interested in how social movements constitute themselves long before they are formally recognized as such. I try to show this through a discussion of different social movements in the book. Here it is an example of AIDS treatment activists where compositional politics involves many diverse and often unexpected actors, spaces, and physical spaces, as you can see on the top left, substances, chemical substances, drugs, social settings, embodied practices, social relationality. It is through this compositional politics that social movements become more than social. Rather than through linear evolution, compositional politics is about creative involution, to use a term from Deleuze and Guattari. Symbiogenesis, alliance building, material articulation, commensality, composition, wet, as you can see here, or dry, the intimate fusion of the digital and the material. Compositional objects acquire their full potential within an experimental and experimenting community, such as the synth by the experimental group Dirty Electronics in the city I live in, Leicester. Social interaction, movements of the body, and more than human dimensions, such as gestures, temperature, the ambient lights, all compose what a synthesizer is for these experimental objects. The composition of experience and materiality makes material creativity a core dimension of more than social movements. And here is now my second question about the book. It is about invention and creativity. Now we know that creativity and craft, material creativity, is not new. Raoul Vaneigem and other situationists believe that creativity and not labor is the driving force of human history. But Vaneigem's unearthing of the emancipatory potential of creativity against the oppressive nature of labor was a sign of a broader social transformation happening in the 60s and 70s. Creativity was transforming into a genuine productive force in the post-industrial cognitive capitalism of global North societies, something that came to dominate the regime of accumulation of our global North societies in the 90s and 2000s. Now, in the recent revival of creativity in the maker movements and the more broader craft culture, we see another second revival of creativity as it turns back to its supposed artisanal roots to material production. But this revival of creativity in the global North is not just a nostalgia, it is an aspiration to reaffirm ethnocentric and nationalist material power in order to assert a stronger position in global production networks. And this is my question to myself and to the book. Creativity, material creativity, is very ambivalent. And there is a prospect, or the prospect here is to capitalize on people's material creativity, everyone's material creativity everywhere. This is the logic of an evolving regime of accumulation that we see now. And one cannot avoid seeing today the eventual defeat of Vaneigem's emancipatory vision of creativity as the only force that can rid us of work. And I think that this is a serious question for all of us, at least it's for me personally, when I'm thinking about my own practice, where I was thinking that I counterbalance work with creativity, because creativity is what allows me to develop these experimental practices. But if we are in a moment of appropriation, then what is the meaning for, of course, for our self-understanding, but also for the politics emerging out of this core notion of political practice, of new and modern social movements? The capture of creativity is very much exemplified in the working and living conditions of precarity. And many of us, and with Andrea, we have been involved in the movements of precarization for many, many years now. And this is, I think, something that goes hand in hand with the other side, the promise of creativity. Now, the role of invention and reinvention is key to these precarized conditions of material technoscientific creativity. In technoscience, what counts as invention is not primarily what we used to think that invention is, which is the individual experimental achievement that gives coherence to traditional experimental scientific practice, usually in the lab. Rather, invention is achieved through dispersed experimentation. Invention in modern social movements becomes distributed invention power. The work that sustains distributed invention power is an embodied and haptic experimental practice. It operates within the constraints and the complex interactions of local ecologies, and it always implies an involvement in the lives of other living and non-living beings and objects. It is an ethopoetical practice, in the words of Maria Puig-Vallacasa, the simultaneous production of ethos, embodied ethos, and ontology, local situated ontology. In modern social movements, there is not such thing as a pre-existing pattern of organization that unifies all different actors and practices. Modern social movements are are like stacked ontologies in forests and in the forest gardens that inspired permaculture to create. So in forest and forest gardens, you have many different layers. Here you can see some of them. So you have many different layers of plants stacked in relation to each other, all of them on the same ground and on very limited space, and coacting. And the way they are stacked makes forest garden more or less successful in surviving changes within their ecological spaces. And I'm thinking of a similar form of ontological stacking in the experimental practices of modern social movements. So stacking is topological. It is about relative locations, how elements of an ecosystem coact as long as they are mutually dependent and are in positions that allow them to assist each other. Stacking emerges as ontologies branch to new ones. The making of alternative ontologies out from what existed before. Alterontologies. It's about forking, branching, diverting words to unexpected paths, even if these paths cannot be planned in advance. Start even if you don't know how. So in the permaculture's forest garden, one can get many and very different output from just one single element. Within the experimental space of the Lester Hack space, a common plastic bottle, as you can see here, can be engaged in many different and unexpected ways. But not anyone and not everything can become part of experimental practice. So this is another question. So what are I think that there needs to be more work done in defining the specificity of experimental practice within certain modern social movements. The book tries to approach this, but I think there is more needed here. It tries to approach this by acknowledging that in the case of the plastic bottles, only very few of them enter into an experimental arrangement. They become part, most of them become part of these 10 million tons of plastic that end up in the oceans every year and are worn down into trillions of pieces of microplastic, ending in the stomachs of sea creatures and seabirds and us, actually, as you can see in this picture. So objects and things are not always part of experimental practice and cannot be. Certain objects and things become accessible to specific objects, animals, and humans only in certain conditions, and simultaneously animals and plants become engaged only in specific type of interactions, and only some humans become committed to certain projects. So there is experimental practice has specificity that I think needs to be defined more clearly. The experimental practice of alterontologies needs to be very specific. They involve transversality between disparate material registers of human and non-human communities of life. And they also involve the creation of commensal bonds and the existence in intimate relations which are not necessarily beneficial nor harming for most of the participants. So commensality is another key term for understanding experimental practice. So in experimental practices such as this one created by Nomeda and Gediminas Urbonas for making novel materials with mycelium, which are mushroom roots, learning, the process of learning is the key. Experimenting is about transversal learning. This is an embodied material practical literacy sustained by communal infrastructures. For experimental learning to take place, it is crucial to create and weave new infrastructures together. Unlike large-scale instituted infrastructures, the infrastructures that we know and we usually imagine and think of when we are referring to infrastructures, experimental infrastructures are maintained by the communities that participate in them. So they are not maintained in a top-down hierarchical way. They are maintained through these communal practices. These communal infrastructures are open, transferable, modifiable, and allow communities to exist and survive when instituted infrastructure break down by accident or intent. And we have seen a lot of cases about how communal infrastructures and this low-key grassroots infrastructure maintains through the communities which participate in them come to play a crucial role when we have collapse of infrastructures. In science and technology studies, we have a lot of studies of infrastructures and how they are felt and what happens when they break down. And Katrina was in the post-Katrina situation with the collapse of the infrastructure of a whole city was widely analyzed in science and technology studies, but we have many other studies of different types of infrastructure ranging from energy to housing, to transport, to fuels, to food provision, and so on. So the creation of these alternative infrastructures that quintessentially I thought it can be captured in a seed ball, which you can see here, a seed ball as a transferable infrastructure of life, are generous infrastructures. Generous in the sense that they allow these communities to maintain and to continue to exist when other infrastructures collapse. Generosity is the defining moment, I think, of alterontological practice. So I'm interested in how generous infrastructures are put to work differently in different places. So, and against this masculinist vision of the creative maker, which you can see here with a robot standing on the whole planet, a robot stamping its techno-scientific feet on the planet. You have the other vision of Maker for Africa, which claims that makers' infrastructures travel in minor ways across the continent, and yet they are always different. They travel, there is something that there is a continuity of practice that travel, but they are also always different, and they are situated in the specific ingenuity and in the specific material necessities or affordances, to use Gibson's term, of the involved communities. Here, material creativity, which traditionally belongs to global north post-industrialism, is mobilized to assert a decolonial position. On a geopolitical scale, it turns an increasingly instituted infrastructure as this of the maker movement infrastructure, which becomes very much formalized, hierarchical. It turns it into a generous one. The aim of Alterontologies is to develop autonomous pathways that interrupt the colonial epistemic matrix of Western modernity. And if we assume that there are plural ways of being in the world, as Chakrabarty says, then there are also plural ways of making the world. The autonomy of the modern social movements consists in creating alternative modes of interdependence. So this is another question. What is the meaning of autonomy? Because it is a crucial term for social movements. The book defines it as something that it is the creation of alternative modes of interdependence. Of course, interdependence is counterintuitive in the sense of a humanist understanding of autonomy, but we are not talking about a humanist understanding of autonomy. In a post-humanist world, autonomy is about such creative, alternative, alterontological modes of interdependence. But I think that we need to do more to understand the political autonomy of social movement today. So these are my own questions to the book, and I have an afterthought is related to my current research, which is on chemicals and materials and their ecological presence, and an understanding of justice, which very much was developed within experimental practice. I want to go back to the beginning, which is also the beginning of the book and the beginning of the ideas about the commons and the social movements. So the commoners of the Charnwood Forest lived in the forest. Magna Carta, which is the key document for the commons, goes hand in hand with the Charter of the Forest. The Charter of the Forest reestablished people's access to the forest and effectively acknowledged that the commons are in the heart of social reproduction and ecological reproduction. And even more so, ecological reproduction is in the heart of social reproduction. So not the other way around. The Charter of the Forest was issued in 1217 and more than 800 years ago, and it is as old as this ancient oak tree. Theirs was a world of wood. Ours today is a world of oil, and it is also a world of waste and pollution. But we are also in a moment that some people start to realize that an experimental engagement with these chemicals and materials is necessary. Of course, this experimental engagement with materials and chemicals will never be enough to counteract the current magnitude of ecological degradation. We might not make it in time. Someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of capitalism than a world without anthropogenic chemicals. There might not be enough time, but despite that, there are many attempts to slowly start, and how we can actually slowly start to learn how to move back to plant matter and to wood. Within such experimental practices, some humans start to reconsider the time scales of our geoexistence. The future is not what will come, but what was. Future is not what will come, but what was. Ours is a world of oil, but theirs, these kids, might be, can be, hopefully will be a world of forest again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. Thank you. It has been a great presentation. So now, if you agree, Laura Centemeri, you have Yeah, 15 minutes. And after Laura, we will have Naomi Miller, then Lara Monticelli, Roberta Raffaetà, and Luigi Pellizzoni. So we have something more than 1 hour, 1 hour and 15 minutes. So if for you it's fine, we can follow this order. And this is a space for asking questions and for commenting the book of Dimitris.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this introduction. And thank you, Luigi, for inviting me. And thank you, Dimitris, for this very inspiring book and speech. And let me shortly explain what I do as a researcher, because I think that my comments and questions are really related to what I do as a research. So I'm a sociologist, and I inscribe myself in a tradition of pragmatic sociology and pragmatism. And I've been working on mobilizations on environmental issues. In particular, I have done research on environmental disaster situations, the Seveso disaster in Italy, more specifically, and on environmental conflicts. And in particular, I have studied the protests against the expansion of the Malpensa airport in the Milan area, so in Italy, since the 1970s. And in recent years, I've been involved in the permaculture movement, and I have done research on the spreading of permaculture in Italy. With this research on permaculture, I think I meet the interest of Dimitris for what he defines as more than a social movement. But that's true that already when studying mobilizations in Seveso after the dioxin disaster and the conflicts concerning the expansion of the Malpensa airport in Italy, I was confronted with activists choosing forms of in-place resistance. That's how I define this kind of action. That is, activists who choose, rather than protesting, to work on reorganizing interdependencies with places of nature and their non-human inhabitants, so to make them lived and loved places, and considering this practical engagement as a form of both repairing and resistance. And of course, Dimitris' book for me has been of a great abundance of insights and inspiration, even if I felt sometimes at times overwhelmed by the creativity in concepts and this capacity to draw this big historical narrative. And I really admire this speculative gesture. And I approached the book. I mean, at the end of the book, I sort of found the key to the book, which is the generosity of the book. So drawing on this notion that Dimitris explained in his presentation and which is discussed in the book, my key to the book was to consider this book as a generous book. So, I mean, and I felt myself allowed to pick what I really think it's useful for me in this book to advance in my own research. I mean, a thing that I missed in the book is maybe the fieldwork. I mean, Dimitris explained very well the Baroque fieldworking. So there is fieldwork, but there is no ethnographic fieldwork. And since what I do is basically ethnography, it was a little bit difficult for me. I mean, often because I could not really understand what Dimitris had in mind, since there was not this, I mean, ethnographic account of the situation he explores. And in particular, I mean, I was really intrigued by the idea of doing it without yourself, which is the key that Dimitris find to explain what craft here, what care is. So I was really intrigued by this doing it without yourself, and my reflex is always to find for what kind of capacities and what kind of skills are needed for this doing it without yourself. And so my curiosity is, of course, for the fact that this doing it without yourself needs to develop some competencies, and so it is not something that is simply to achieve, let's say. I mean, this interest in the competencies which are needed for in order to do it without yourself is related to let's say an interest in the forms of exclusion that can be associated with this kind of organization. So as a sort of let's say bias that I have I'm always looking to pay. I mean, I always try to pay attention to when things goes wrong, which is a classical ethnographic reflex, which is to pay attention to situation where the organization or the way to coordinate are not working, because this is a way to understand the kind of requirements to the success of the engagement, let's say. So for sure, I mean, I would have loved to have this ethnographic material to relate more to my own experience of observation, and especially concerning this idea of care as do it without yourself. I mean, I was intrigued, but at the same time, I would say in my fieldwork, caring was related in my reading to a capacity to be at the same time in a sort of porosity. I mean, which means being in a capacity to listen, a capacity to see, to notice, and to feel, in which I can recognize a form of do it without yourself, but at the same time there was always a form of reflexivity I mean at work, a reflexivity that needed to be trained. So I'm back again to this aspect of what is needed in order to have this happy organization of the material things through doing it without yourself. And a related issue for me is that of autonomy. And if I understand correctly, so what autonomy would be would mean an organization of materiality that makes conditions of ecological and social justice materially ingrained. And I mean, my question is that in order to do this, materiality must be given a form, and autonomy so means leaving this form free to modify itself by following matter. So my question is about, I mean, this relation to forms and to shaping and giving forms and the temporality of forms. And a related question for me is what kind of link between these modern social movements and that specific technique, which is law. I mean, not intended as the organized order by the state, but as the technique which is used to put things in shape and organize the form of order. And one thing has been extremely inspiring for me in reading Dimitris' book, which is this need to challenge the dominant frameworks to understand social movements and bring the analysis of social movements back into the concrete world of matter, and therefore approach them as more than social movements. I mean, I mean, working on environmental issues and on environmental movements, this need to bring movements back to materiality is clear to me, and I think that this move from social movements to more than social movements and to movements to core is really important if social sciences want to avoid to be always a step backwards in the understanding of society. And from this point of view, I mean, the Baroque field working that Dimitris practice is a very challenging and interesting kind of methodology. And another point in which I would like to hear more is this idea of justice as related to materiality, in terms of justice becomes ingrained in the materiality of being. That is, that it's not clear to me if this is one kind of justice, and then there are other issues of justice too. And then, I mean, how in these places of autonomy, the multiple senses of justice are addressed. I mean, how this. I mean, what I observed in the permaculture projects. I experienced was sometimes conflicting visions about maybe not the material justice, but other forms of justice. So I was interested in hearing more about how this understanding of justice is related to other possible senses of justice. And I have maybe two last remarks that I think are really related to the kind of anthropological, let's say, presuppositions. I introduce myself saying that I inscribe my work in the pragmatist tradition, and I think it's important because in this tradition, evaluation has a very peculiar status, because it's an activity that human beings do, but as well non-human beings do. So there is an idea through the notion of adaptation that, I mean, the evaluative exercise is something which is shared across human and non-humans. And it's just that humans can adapt the environment, accommodate to the environment, and adjust to the environment. So there is this attention to variety of ways in which the relation between beings and the environment becomes, I mean, the agent. I mean, and in my experience of permaculture, what I was particularly intrigued by was exactly this effort to train people to be able to move across a wide variety of ways of attributing valuing the centering, of course, human evaluation, taking into account ecomimesis as a way to, let's say, take into account other ways of valuing, non-human ways of valuing. And I was really intrigued by how this diversity was organized. But at the same time, of course, this diversity was also a reason of sometimes disagreement, and sometimes it was at the origin as well of the end of this kind of project. And so I come to the remark, to the question, which is maybe I would like Dimitris to explain a little bit more the anthropological presuppositions, because it seems to me that there's a lot about openness, transformation, mobility, connectivity, and what place for stability, securization as something that is needed to in the relation to the material surroundings. And my second question is connected, and it is a question about the idea of culture evaluation. So a notion that appears in the discussion on what Dimitris called biofinancialization. And this point also was really very interesting and inspiring to me. In a sense, Dimitris talks about a financial culture evaluation, which is described as a dominant culture evaluation today, which consists in a logic that attributes value according to what is the expected monetary return of an investment in the future. And therefore, what gives value in the future is what will give access to an increased monetary return, a logic that descends into daily life, that creeps into relationships with people and the material world in parallel with the spreading of new technologies that are propitious to this transformation. But then I was wondering, what about cultural evaluation in these spaces of autonomy? I mean, these spaces of autonomy are also spaces of autonomous valuation, and how to describe this autonomous valuation that is in place in the spaces of autonomy. Because I mean, the reference to the commons for me is not an answer, because commons too, I mean, or commons should be defined as a specific culture of evaluation. So I stop here and I leave the floor to the other colleagues, and thank you again for this opportunity to read and comment on Dimitris' work.
Thank you very much, Laura. So Naomi Milner, thank you very much for being with us.
Great. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm really excited to be in dialogue with various colleagues who've inspired me from different contexts, including political ecology, STS, and degrowth, which I think of particularly as convivial contexts of academia, which aren't as common or marked by care as we might like. And in a minute, I'm going to try and take commoning and care as my starting point for discussing experimental matters, as these are the key terms that immediately came to my mind when I thought not just of the book itself, but of various conversations with Dimitris and with others of you I've met before. First, I'll just say who I am. I'm a human geographer and political ecologist based at the University of Bristol. I work mainly on the new geographies of conservation, increasingly quite a militarized conservation in Latin America, as well as the knowledge practices associated with environmental politics. And I've always been in my work, and still am, interested in what Dimitris terms experimental practices, which I understand as forms of making and doing that engage with actually existing material conditions and technologies, and seek to rework them towards different, more spacious and pluriversal horizons. So it's a real pleasure to be asked to discuss the book, which situates those experimental practices in relation to the more than social movements Dimitris seeks to define and follow. And these are movements which aim through material practices and engagements to constitute alternative forms of worlding to the dominant ones, at the same time as refusing various forms of enclosure and the foreclosure of worlds. The way these movements and their practices are unpacked in the book really speak to the experimental food and permaculture collectives I've studied in El Salvador, the UK, and India, as also to my more recent work on the experimental use of monitoring technologies like drones in forest conservation. Those are technologies introduced ostensibly to monitor forest cover and illegal logging, but which are actually being used to survey and police communities as part of the wider securitization of conservation areas, a form of biosecuritization, if you like. But what's interesting is that at the same time, those technologies, including drones, are also being used by forest communities to document their own conservation activities and the incursions of others, as part of a kind of territorial defence by rural communities, in the process giving rise to kind of new ways of welding the forest, a bit like what Dimitris was just talking about. It is worth saying I don't actually like drones. We often find ourselves studying things we don't like. But I do see there a reappropriation of what you might call a war machine to create new kinds of commoning and new forms of testimony to the presence of living communities. So in thinking through those practices, I've been particularly inspired by the way that in the book, Dimitris opens up the political aesthetic dimensions of technoscience as part of his account of what makes an experimental practice. And that includes their capacities to enact political disagreement by presencing what's here already, what's among us, but isn't seen or counted as part of the social, as well as their capacity to unfold possibility creatively rather than contain it according to a logic of bioaccumulation. So this takes place in the book through their enactment of what Dimitris calls Alterontologies, which in my understanding re-articulate the basic conditions of sharing that ground human existence, refusing in the process the forms of enclosure and bioaccumulation that want to colonize them into a kind of specific curve of growth. And so this work for me is connected with a broader ethos of care that we can see in feminist science and technology scholarship, thinking of people like Donna Haraway, who don't only seek to follow how technoscience transforms our world, but also who constantly seek to engage with its capacities to create more ample, more solidaristic forms of doing and making. So technology in such scholarship is not to be seen as the enemy, but an ambivalent set of ways of making the world or making worlds, and of establishing circuits between different parts of life. But one thing I want to notice is that emphasis on care isn't always already part of many STS projects, for all the tools they give us. We know that in many of the emblematic studies of STS, science and technology studies, that we see the ways that the social dimensions of science in ways that do unsettle a kind of master narrative. They do reveal how things could have happened otherwise, that colonial dominance was always already fragile and contingent. But these studies often follow the technologies, inventions, the systems that won out, that came to dominate over all the others, that succeeded in assembling all the allies they needed, so we don't get to find out what happens to the others or the relationships between them. So what happens when you think STS together with an ethos of care? This kind of different question was an event that Dimitris organised with others. It was called STS Involved in the UK, and it focused on looking at care as being central to such work, as also to the ways that we think about our context of labour and employment. And this is something that really sparkles from the book for me, a concern with what these techno-scientific practices add up to and what they offer to collective projects of just and careful transformation. So with Dimitris, we could see this focus on care as an essential part of a decolonial politics of matter and really seek to foreground care when we think about it. A politics that challenges epistemic coloniality, Dimitris tells us, by transforming materially everyday ontologies of existence. So in the introduction, Dimitris opens up the aesthetic dimension of that politics by drawing on Jacques Rancière, someone who's also inspired a lot of my work, whose starting point, I'm quoting, is not inclusion, but the emergence of the invisibilized and the imperceptible, of those who have no place within existing normalizing political institutions. So a decolonial politics of matter, then, is one that institutes direct changes on the material level of existence, challenging existing conditions of inclusion, and even the idea of inclusion via ontology. Instead, it takes as its starting point an assumption of radical equality. And that's really one of the key points I want to make at this point in time. I want to suggest that care is in the book a fundamentally political aesthetic practice as well as an experimental one. So care is crucial to the book, but care is also about a politics of aesthetics. So I'll just try and say a bit more about that through the terms commoning and care that I've mentioned. We know that debates around the commons abound, and they often draw on Elinor Ostrom's work documenting historical and contemporary cases of commons management. But in conversations with Dimitris and others, here the key word is not so much commons as commoning as a verb. And that commoning is an activity of reclaiming and reorientating human nature relations through the creation of these Alterontologies, at the same time as a rejection of forms of enclosure that want to divide fundamental sharing away from itself. So it's an ontological activity, it's a more than human, and it's a more than social activity. It always involves humans, although this is a question I'd like to ask, does it always involve humans? But it imbricates them in material relationships, prosthetic relationships with things, and metabolic relationships that produce and transform the material conditions that humans live in and through. Meanwhile, commoning crucially involves ecologies, growing things, elements that can become polluted or exhausted, although, as Dimitris mentioned in his talk, I do raise that question of, does it always have to do that? But it always interfaces with social issues and concerns, the struggle to push back against the colonization of human labour for profit, or the dispossession of human communities for bioaccumulation. So in these terms, we don't so much think about natural resources over there managed by humans over here, but more than social movements acting to expand the conditions for autonomous creation and autonomous politics. With autonomy meaning, of course, here, not independent as such, but a form of social change coming from below or imminently from within a given system, as far as I understand. So I'm reading this as a kind of value production that is not anchored to capital, but instead can transform and create new ontological conditions for life through experimentation. So here Dimitris' work positions itself in quite an interesting way between new work on post-humanism and the politics of matter and studies of autonomous social movements and their politics on the other. And that links with the second key point I want to draw out, that commoning needs to be seen as a fundamentally ontological activity, and that this is something, at least according to the book, that those of us concerned with autonomous social movements need to get hold of. When we think of social movements, Dimitris points out, we rarely understand them as forms of action that are attempting to work on the material conditions of everyday life and mundane ontologies in which they operate. Yet this is what they stand to offer contexts that are virtually saturated by the logic of biofinancialization. So this emphasis, this kind of double move, is something I see as a thread running through most of the chapters. In chapter 2, we look at it through the theme of biofinancialization. As we learn on page 46, there is no commons versus biofinancialization, but biofinancialization in the commons. So everything is in the domain of commons, but also in the realm of biofinancial accumulation. That's the tension, and the call is thus to constantly reclaim forms of making from within or from below. Then in chapter 8, we come to understand that even domains we might think about as being more alternative, like maker culture, are also wired up to biofinancialization. And yet, of course, the existence of creativity always relies on commons, so one needs reclaiming from the other. In chapter 6, we think about it in terms of neuroscience, that matter within technoscience is fully privatized and yet simultaneously belongs fully to the commons. So the question I hear Dimitris asking over and over again in the book is, how can commons be expanded when it's fused with biofinancialization and its logics? And then how can we define the terms of autonomy if it's understood as experimental practice within these conditions, not outside them or against them? So this question is what situates the decolonial politics of matter. Decolonial making is an active practice of unmaking. It's a political aesthetic activity involving the declaring of a wrong in Rancière's terms and the articulation of a non-common reality, one that is not fully shared, at least not yet. That aesthetic aspect is also vital to the arguments of chapter 3 on migration and the mobile commons, where movement itself becomes a political and social act, an effective gesture that undoes statist and static forms of seeing and saying from within, in the process creating new infrastructures for commons. And here we come back to care, because what ties those practices and spaces together is a nexus of care, enacted through cooperation, friendships, trust, and so on. Yet still this care, we're reminded, must be understood as being directed towards the post-human conditions of life, not just about being humane. And finally, the entanglement of care, commoning, aesthetics, and ontology is perhaps most clear in chapter 5, Insurgent Posthumanism, which I think is one of my favourites. And here we learn that although posthumanism inspires a vital interest in matter, it can come with its own problems. It risks replacing humanist universalism with the worst universalism of all, the idea that humans are one and that there are no divisions among them. And it also risks homogenizing all non-humans into a vast and uniform otherness. So the quest in the imminent terms of experiential, more than human or more than social movements is to restore justice in the immediate ecologies that certain humans and certain non-humans are inhabiting, rather than to describe an abstract justice or gesture of inclusion. And for me, this move of specifically political aesthetic disagreement remains central in differentiating a move to commoning via experimentation with alterontologies and care through collective unmaking from a version of experimental creation that involves the repetition of more of the same. So really it's that political aesthetic dimension of care and the ontological dimensions of commoning that I want to push through to the discussion and see if that landed in a similar way with others. And if I was to raise a question in closing, it would probably be, how do we know or apprehend forms of making that enact disagreement rather than those that reproduce the conditions for bioaccumulation? Are there styles or forms of making that evidence decoloniality, decolonial aesthetics? Or will it always look and feel more like a proliferation of styles? And I wondered, we just heard about the Baroque in fieldworking, which I think is a really lovely expression, but I wonder if the Baroque transfers as well across to how we think about making experimentation within more than social movements. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And now we have Lara Monticelli. Thank you for being with us. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Andrea. So I would like to start, first of all, by thanking Luigi and all the community here for inviting me. Of course, I'm new to this community, so I'll just spend a couple of words introducing myself. So I'm a researcher based in Denmark at Copenhagen Business School, and I'm an economic and political sociologist, and I'm currently working on a Marie Curie project titled Eco-Villages as Laboratories of Sustainability and Social Change. So you can already from the title of my project see why I'm very happy to be here. So my research, in fact, focuses on how intentional communities and eco-communities and communes are trying to embody a critique of capitalism, but also embody an alternative. In parallel to this, so in the project, I'm merging research from social movement studies, critical theory, and social innovation studies. In parallel to that, in 2017, I co-founded a research network that is very interdisciplinary as well, like this one, with a colleague which was formerly based at the University of Leicester, Torsten Gielen, which is titled Alternatives to Capitalism. And this network, of course, meets every year and now counts more or less 400 members. And at the moment, I'm working on an edited book on the concept of prefiguration and prefigurative politics, to which also some of the people here, like Laura Centemeri, are participating. So I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to read your book, Dimitris, because it gave me the opportunity to delve into new literature for me, which was really new, and namely the literature focusing on the new materialism and the relationship between human and non-human, and also post-human. Your Baroque fieldworking makes the book really enjoyable to read, definitely not boring. But of course, also given the time constraint that we have, I'll try to engage mostly with those key concepts, right, that resonate with my own research. And these three concepts, which someone else has already touched upon, are more than social movements, the concept of material spirituality, which actually you borrow from Della Bella Casa. And third, your reflections on post-liberalism and the culture of valuation and biofinancialization. So starting with the concept of more than social movements, of course, this I think is one of the pivotal concepts and the milestones of your book. You define them as movements that strive towards the creation of this Alterontology and the strive to reconfigure the relationship between human and non-human. Your point of departure, I think, is a point of departure that you share with many scholars within the field of political participation and social movement studies, which is the realization that traditional forms of political participation are not sufficient, are not enough. And in chapter 4, which I really enjoyed, you trace a chronological history of social movements in parallel with a story of the evolution of Marxist and critical thought. You juxtapose the thought of young Marx and his sympathy towards what you call activist materialism with the later writings of Marx and Engels, in which instead we find a strong ontological, and I would add epistemological dualism between reason versus idealism, or matter and mind, and I would say also man, human, over nature. And this dualism influenced, as we know, much of the socialist politics revolutions in the 19th and 20th century. And I found a quote that I think epitomizes very well this influence that this dualism had on the politics and on the social movements and political parties and political projects of the past century. So it is a quote from Leon Trotsky from a essay published in 1923 titled Socialism and the Human Future. And in this essay, Trotsky says, in the future, man will occupy himself with re-registering mountains and rivers, and will earnestly and repeatedly make improvements in nature. In the end, he will have rebuilt the earth, if not in his own image, at least according to his own taste. We have not the slightest fear that this taste will be bad. Through the machine, man in socialist society will command nature in its entirety. End quote. So this is definitely epitomizing this dualism of man, and man is interesting. There's a gendered here use of man, of course, over nature. And I still find this dualism very much present now. If we look at politics, right? I'm just thinking about Elon Musk fantasies of dominating Mars. This dualism is actually transcending the planetary boundaries. But going back to your chronological history of social movements, so you described the new social movement of the 60s, of course, and then the shift towards a more cultural Marxism in the 90s and the emergence of what we call, of course, the cultural identity movements, right? And then what I found a very kind of welcome discovery in your book is that a lot of us, and of us I mean social movement scholars, political participation scholars, we found a pivotal movement in the crisis of 2008-2009. I think a lot of us realized that something had happened, a fundamental shift in the way of in the way that social movements were operating has happened in those years. And a lot of us started to look for new definitions because the definition of identity movements was not satisfactory anymore. And clearly the definition of new social movement was also not satisfactory anymore. And so what you call more than social movements, right? In my own research, I call prefigurative movement. And actually some colleagues, I wanted to use the definition new social movements, but that sounded too ugly. So some colleagues of mine very nicely told me, no, don't use it. It's too bad. But prefigurative movements actually, I think, have a lot in common with what you define more than social movements, because they also strive towards creating new wordings. And here I'm quoting you. They try to enact an opening in our thinking and practice to other values, idea, and ways of being. And here, of course, it's my research on eco-villages as well, which I find super relevant. And why eco-villages? Because I think that eco-villages are movements a peculiar type of movement that are pushing the boundaries of experimentation to the most radical extent. In these communities, we really find what Donna Haraway in her books called the sympoiesis, as a way, she uses sympoiesis meaning as a doing together, not only between humans, but also between humans and non-humans. We really find generous infrastructures, we really find attempts to make kinship. In this book, the Two Lean, Donna Haraway describes in a post-apocalyptic era, little groups of men, women, and children trying to establish small communities and save species and plants from extinction. And this is actually, when I read it, I was like, wow, but this is actually happening now in the real world, you know? And these are eco-villages. Like, for instance, I can give you a couple of examples. In the north of Italy, we have this community, Damanhur, in which the inhabitants, in the moment in which they enter the community, they have to choose a name of an animal, which become their name through the community. So you have a wolf, a butterfly, a dolphin, and this become their true name within the community in their interaction. But there is more. In this community, they invented a machine that can transform the vibration and the little movements of plants into music. And so there are concerts in which there is the music of the plants mixed with the music of the humans. So what it is, if this is not sympoiesis? I mean, this is a wonderful example of sympoiesis. But then going back, and I want just to end this observation with a question for you. So this is, of course, these communities are all, and also the modern social movements that you describe in your book are niche, are interstitial movements. But what I've noticed is in the last years, a lot of this discussion has also entered the more, we can say, mainstream politics. And also many of the most prominent Marxist thinkers right now are and define themselves as eco-socialists. So I was wondering also, how does this eco-socialist narrative fit into your chronology? Because I couldn't see it, right? So maybe I would like to discuss with you later. And then second, so we pass to the second point, the material spirituality. You say at page 6, there is a spiritual dimension in the experimental practice. Well, I know that for most social scientists, talking about spirituality evokes a considerable distaste. But I really want to emphasize here that religion is not spirituality and vice versa. But we can think about spirituality as a praxis of the spirit. And in another study that I've conducted with a friend and colleague, Sriamai Clarence Smith, of another community in the south of India called Auroville, in this community, the material is spiritual. And the goal in this community is to bring consciousness into the matter through what they call karma yoga, the yoga of work. Everything in the matter is a manifestation of consciousness. And there's a lot of experimental practices, regenerated forest, and I'm thinking about your current work, Dimitris, on reparative justice. There's an effort to go beyond financialized valuation. There are supermarkets in this community with no price tags. There are new technologies for organic farming and permaculture, and learning practices. So definitely a lot of experimentation going on. But of course, I would like to point out here, and you mentioned it as well at a certain point in the book, that so it's not a matter of scalability, and I partly agree. But at the same time, I still think that we should reflect on how much these practices are replicable and scalable, because most of them are, in some senses, an exit strategy from capitalism. And I know that you actually published a book called Escape Routes, Dimitris. But some of these movements are temporary experimentation. They often get co-opted or repressed either by the market or by the state. And here I want to just say, okay, what is the relationship between your modern social movements and my prefigurative movements with capitalism. And this actually allows me to pass to my third and final point, which is your reflections on post-liberalism, the culture of valuation, where the entire planet actually is becoming an asset. I've noticed through the book that you prefer to use the term financialization rather than capitalism. And maybe also I would be interested to know why. But I think that your idea that this valuation, this biofinancialization is so pervasive that it becomes a form of life, I think is very much in line with what German philosopher Rahel Jaggi describes capitalism. She describes capitalism as a form of life. And maybe I think your research could be informed, if you don't know her already, by Rahel Jaggi's work. In fact, she says that under capitalism, we are denied the capacity to participate in fundamental decisions about who we are, who we want to be, and about what our form of life should be. So capitalism in some sense denies us the possibility of being free and the possibility of being autonomous. And I also agree with Laura Centeneri that autonomy is a very important concept of your book, and autonomy especially in relationship to capitalism, which allows me to point out one last question, which is, how do we make sure and how do we assess the emancipatory potential and nature of these modern social movements? How do we make sure that they are not co-opted or that they don't become an expression of some progressive post-liberalism? Because we know that, for example, some maker spaces, some hacker movement spaces, they get then co-opted by big corporations, big tech, and so on and so forth. So how much autonomy is actually preserved there? And then just to close, out of curiosity, Dimitris, so right now, we all know there's been a lot of attention on terming and using and finding terminology to define the epoch in which we're living. We all know the definition of Anthropocene, Moore's definition of Capitalocene, but also in the last years, we're looking at the future, right? And so some authors have talking a bit of Donna Haraway, talking about the Cthulhu-Lean, right? Cthulhu-Scene. And then we have the founder of the Gaia theory, James Lovelock, talking about the Nova-Scene, an epoch in which the cyborgs take over the humans. So I'm wondering, what is your take on the future, which is also, interestingly, like capitalism, a term with which maybe you don't engage so much throughout the book? Thank you very much, Dimitris, and to everyone.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you very much. Now, Roberta Raffetta. Thank you.
So, hello everybody. Hello Dimitris. Thanks to Luigi Pellizzoni and to all the POE community to organize this very interesting event, and also thanks to Andrea Gelfi for his introduction. So where to start? This book has been full of insights and very interesting things for me to read. So for my discussion, I just had to select a few. I will start with some methodological comments, then proceeding with some into epistemological discussion, and then politics, and then some final remarks. First of all, let me briefly introduce myself to position how I received this book. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm currently working as a researcher in a ERC-funded project that analyzes ethnographically the moral turn in finance. And I am analyzing specifically what will be of Corona bonds, so how they will be used and what they will be. This draws from my background. I'm a medical anthropologist. I started as a medical anthropologist, And but recently, in the last year, I'm interested in overall in the topic of cohabitation, how we as humans can cohabit well with non-humans, and specifically with microbes. And in particular, I'm interested how technoscience mediates this cohabitation, how technoscience configure and produces scenarios of cohabitation between we as humans and microbes and viruses as well. So this is a little bit my what I'm doing and my background. So how receive this interesting book? I found, first of all, that this book is in itself a great experimental practice, because you compose and assemble many different domains and topics. You speak about biofinancialization, migration, biomedicine and health governance, technoscience, and even craft and design. So really a very diverse and heterogeneous composition. And what this made me think, it is that, of course, is still very good and possible and productive that we work as social scientists within one single field, one single domain. But your book made me think that is also at the interface between different domains, that probably we can see something emerge, some social and political trends to emerge when we are not so fully committed just into one domain, but when we are able to work at the interfaces. So this is something that made me think. And if I can add a personal note, quite surprisingly, and I don't know if it's chance, but I also have worked in the past exactly in this same domain, migration, biomedicine, now finance, and in the past I worked with designers. So I don't know if it's by chance, so there is something, you know, there. And most recently, in the last 5-6 years, I've been much interested in science, in technoscience. And many times I try to make sense of this continuous trajectory, heterogeneous trajectory I had, and I could see a red thread that was not apparent to all, but was clear to me, and the red thread was my interest in the tension between nature and culture, and how this deploys in different domains. But reading your book, there is something more that became clear to me, is that my interest into technoscience is not just another domain, but as you nicely write, technoscience is not a domain, a specific domain, but is a stage. Is the stage, the background of our contemporary life. So no matter what you are working, you are studying, then technoscience is a presence that needs to be analyzed. Is a presence, is something more than human, more than scientific, and it is so because, as you write, the public sector, the private sphere, the commons fold into each other. And then, because of that, you call for a specificity of analysis, to be very specific about how categories emerge, and which are the specific interactions between the public, the private, the commons. Because you clearly state that we cannot rely anymore on static and dichotomous categories such as state, private, humans, non-humans, emancipation, control, freedom, exploitation. So these categories somehow are a bit updated, but also they lose their capacity to explain deeply what is happening in those times, exactly because they are all entangled together in various ways that it's important to capture. And in this complexity, you propose, you advance your political proposal, that is this of compositional politics. Compositional politics that you propose somehow as an escape from biofinancialization that you illustrate as a Foucauldian, let's say a Foucauldian frame that is brought to its extreme. And you define compositional politics as happening when actors emerge in the political scene by changing the very constitution of being, by arranging materiality in a way to make their emergence possible beyond institutional and mainstream politics. And what I like it very much also is that you describe this emergence both against and within institutional power, in a relation that is neither of a mimesis nor of a conflict, but it places itself in a different position in order to escape the common dialectic, the common logic, but to propose something different. So this was my take and what I really appreciate of your book. What, pretty much like Laura said at the beginning, as an anthropologist, what I felt needing more was more ethnography. Do you hear me? Yes. More ethnography, not for the sake of ethnography, but more ethnography because specifically, especially because your claim is that forms of being and material practices are what can give us a hope for a different world, then we really have to know what those specific new forms and interactions between all the domains are. And this we can know through ethnography, through the analysis of specific place, specific situations, to understand how alterontology can become politics. Because from my experience, I did all that kind of research I explained before, but I'm also, for example, personally engaged in a community development here where I live in the mountains. And I like to think at ourselves as well, kind of indigenous, you know. And from what I see here, for example, from the mountain, it's not that automatic to reverse the hegemony machine by displacing it, because there are many, as you say, as you write, many dispersed, everyday, imperceptible politics. But the question is how they became compositional politics. So I think it's important to have more ethnography to really understand how they can become emancipatory politics. So I think really, as I said before, ethnography not just for the sake of ethnography, but because ethnography has a political commitment in showing other people, other movements, that this might happen, that alterontologies might happen, might emerge, and also which might be the constraints, the opportunities, the strategies, or the tactics. So I think it's important through ethnography, to amplify the awareness of other people, of our movements, that alterontologies might exist. And in order to do that, I think we really have to be specific, because, for example, words as matter or words as practice, they might mean many different things. For example, also this motto, start even if you don't know how, that is guiding parts of the maker's culture. It might sound pretty much as another motto, that is Nike, just do it. You know, but at the roots, there are two different sensibilities, very different ethics. And so I think it's really important to be very specific and to grasp all the interactions, the ethics, the politics that stay at the ground of this. And I share pretty much with Laura her comment about that. In order to do that, in order to raise this awareness, I think there should be place for reflexivity, and that this reflexivity has to be trained somewhere else. I have spoken about this as a theoretical practice. So I really agree with you that it's important to experiment, to have experimental practice, but I also think that reflection should be there with us in our experimentation. And this is how I make sense of the ethics of care. What is care? Care is doing without myself, but is also somehow in a second moment being there to be reflective on how the relation is going. So this care with this reflexivity. Otherwise, my fear is that all risk remains something for a cultural elite, in a sense, or risks, as Lara also was emphasizing, to being recaptured by a neoliberal logic and ethics. So as a final comment, also, I wanted to give an example from my current fieldwork, past fieldwork with scientists working with microbes, those bioinformatics that try to visualize and map and analyze those ecologies of microbes. They work within institutional science, but through ethnography, it's also possible to find that within them there are some tendencies of a kind of community technoscience. There are some aspects of that, aspects or aspirational also attitude toward a commoning culture. So what I just wanted to say, as you rightly showed before, is that we are really in a moment in which we cannot simplify into dichotomies. And I think it's important also in institutional settings to find the cracks and to try to connect and establish alliances with those people that, despite being in institutional setting, can create some alterontologies within those institutional settings, because this might amplify the impact we might have. And also this goes back to Lara comments, this also might make somehow scalable something that is by definition not scalable. I don't know if I made myself clear. So these are my thoughts, and thank you very much for all the inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. And now Luigi Pellizzone.
Thanks very much for the comments already put on the table. I think that Dimitris has a lot of things to comment and react. And just to introduce myself very briefly, I'm a sociologist working, I would say, the interface between environmental issues, technoscience, and political sociology. Very quickly, also to leave space for other people to intervene. I will focus on three things, but first let me say what I find among the many merits of the book, two things that put in the framework of other literature in, let's say, new materialism or the ontological turn. The book stands out. First is a genuine interest in social movements, in concrete mobilization, which is often lacking in many discussions that are more theoretical, more speculative, and whatever. So this is a very, very important thing. And the second thing is that Dimitris, my feeling is that he is very, very frequently throughout the book careful in avoiding to buy into the liberating potential of technoscience, because in much literature on posthumanism and whatever, I personally find a little bit of too easy going into the emancipatory capacity of overcoming the old, let's say, Cartesian or dualist take on reality. So possibly for his sensitivity for, let's say, post-coloniality, and so also positionality and historicity makes him wary to go too easily into this direction. So this is my framework for understanding his book. And within this framework, I take 3 points. One has already been touched by Lara and also Roberta, which is the point of scale. The point of scale is very important because we know that capitalism, the last phase of capitalism is the phase of globalization. And so also technoscience has taken a dimension that is very related to big scale. And the way in which the issue of scale is taken by a social movement perspective is taking the opposite side. So downscaling or small scale or contrasting the big scale with showing that there is something else going on which is totally disconnected or oppositional to the big scale. In that sense, I see that we possibly, so it is not like a criticism to the book, but something on which I am personally struggling, as also the other points I will raise. I think that it is a bit too easy to contrast the big scale with the small scale. It is much more to think about scaling. For a start, it may be that the period that which we are witnessing, in which we are living now, it's possibly a period of involuntary degrowth. So the period in which there will be a downscaling, not out of any choice, but out of the very insustainability of very big infrastructures and whatever. So this is something that some authors are actually arguing, and I think it should be taken quite seriously. On the other hand, the very possibility to talk of Alterontologies depends to some extent on the fact that we are taking alterontology up of a background which is based on globalization. I don't know if I'm clear enough. So the way in which we think and conceptualize of the possibility of alternative ontology depends on the fact that there is a globalization that put all the world together in a sense. So it is something that depends on globalization before contrasting globalization. So in that sense, the issue of scale is very important to show that it is not just a matter of downscaling or contrasting the big scale with other scale, but the way in which the other scale we are thinking of depends on the big scale. So I have absolutely no answer on that. It's just a question mark, and just to put a flag on the problem of scaling. I think we are only scratching the problem of scale, because of course many things we love and we would like to continue. If you think also of this present crisis of virus, it depends also on some big scale. You cannot handle an hospital, a big technological infrastructure that is instrumental to delivering some kind of service without keeping it on a certain scale. So, I mean, unless we would like to go back to a way of living that is perfectly fine, but accepting shorter life span and whatever, not addressing some diseases and whatever. So this is just a big question mark. Second point, the point of representation. So I'm pretty in tune with Dimitris' insistence on the pluriverse and criticism against universalism. And a point that I imagine is in the book is a criticism about the way in which authors like Latour, for example, portray the way in which the non-human realm can be integrated or composed with the human realm by way of this parliamentarism, so a way to represent, to portray, to include by way of representation. And Dimitris is quite right, in my view, to be careful about including in this way, because it is including according to the rules of those who include. So it's a way to betraying at the very moment you are trying to include. So his take is to go towards a kind of non-representative politics. So a politics not made in the way the modern nationality has put it. And so in a way that, of course, we have already talked a lot about this point, more about expression, aesthetics, caring, emotion, and whatever. And in that sense, Dimitris aligns with a lot of literature in the last decades about post-foundationalism in politics, and so non-representation. Again, on this point, I pretty much agree with this standpoint, but I also raise a question mark, which is the problem of going too far in the direction of non-representation and refusal of, let's say, traditional politics. Two things. One is that if we think a little bit, neoliberal governmentality has been pointing very much on emotion, affect, everything against the old, let's say, rational, discursive, argumentative way of doing politics. So there is a politics of emotion coming from the neoliberal governmentality. So the question of capture that other commentators have already raised this morning is very important. My personal standpoint on that, I would like to know what Dimitris thinks about that, is that maybe Theodor Adorno made a good point in raising the issue of the link between theory and practice, or concept and matter. So basically what he says is that, okay, being totally theoretical and being totally conceptual is doing identity thinking, so doing an operation of power and domination. But on the other hand, going completely on the other extreme, so totally practical, non-conceptual and whatever, is making an illusion of emancipation, because in so doing you are just subscribing to the situation in which you live, and to imagine something different you necessarily have to do a conceptual operation. So you have to try to construct bridges between different situations, between different concrete situations, and so forth. So it was a kind of dialectical monism, which I find, again, still very interesting. It's not a classical dialectical thinking that Dimitris criticizes quite rightly, but it was a kind of dialectical monism that I think is very, very important. So we need to represent the non-human world in some way, to take it into account, but in non-universalist way, in a non-identical way. So in a way that is respectful of the non-identity of the reminder in any kind of representation and operation. So it's an operation of humility, in a sense. So I would like to know what Dimitris thinks about that. Last point, experimentalism. Of course, since the title of the book, the importance of experimentation is stressed many times. And of course, I subscribe to that. But again, experimentalism is a core to neoliberal governmentality, late capitalism, and we see it for many things. One is the very idea that you cannot properly plan for anything. You have to go by trial and error, because reality is too complex to deal with it in any overarching way. And so the only mechanism of arrangement of things is ex post, the market, basically. And so you have also, as an individual, constantly experiment with yourself. So make an entrepreneur of yourself, change your life, try new things and whatever. Also, we have to consider that the last decades have been also the moment we are living. Has been increasingly characterized by real life experiments. So it's a constant experimentation, pandemics, geoengineering, biotech, GMOs, and whatever. We are within real life experiments, and the mantra is that you have just to be ready to react, to be resilient, to be ready to react to surprise, and so on and so forth. This is also a point that emerged very much in the most recent trend in the, let's say, new materialist literature, which is the shift from the attention to bio to the attention to the geo. So geopolitics, geopower, the intrusion of Gaia, and so on and so forth. So what is interesting there is that it is again a case for experimenting. Since Gaia is an overarching power with which you don't negotiate, you don't discuss, and whatever, what you do is to go again with trial and error. So again, there is an ambivalence. Of course, it is a call for humility, a call for avoiding hybris, and so on and so forth. But this is also close to a kind of a governmental rationality that is constantly inviting us to admit that there is no alternative, This is the only way to go. There is no alternative way. So Alterontologies have to struggle with this challenge to be really emancipatory. So these are, in my view, very interesting points that come up, and of course are partly very interesting addressed by the book, but they are call for any of us to struggle with these points, scale, representation, and experimentation in our next commitments as scholar and also as activists. I stop here not to take other time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And at the moment, there are no comments and questions from the stage. So we wait a couple of minutes. Someone to say something. This is the moment. Or alternatively, we give back the word to Dimitris for answering the many questions coming from these very good 5 interventions. So I will say let's go with Dimitris. What do you think, Dim? It's good for you? Take your time.
I'm happy with whatever you decide. Yeah.
Okay.
Although I think it's quite important and interesting to open the discussion. I mean, I'll do my best to give some ideas and responses to that, but it would be good to continue this afterwards as a discussion also, Andrea. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, well, thank you very much for these comments. They are truly fantastic, and they point towards many of the questions that I have myself to the book, and I don't know. I don't know how other people think about their books or papers, but my feeling is that after a moment, there is so much things happening in a book that you at least I am unable to hold it together as one project. So there are many different aspects, and some of them stay within the book, and they have shape. But there are many other aspects of the book that are excessive, and they try to escape the book, and they do their things on their own, and you cannot always follow them. So, and all of you pointed towards many of these aspects that that are in themselves not finalized, let's say, within the book. They are openings rather than answers. And it might be difficult to answer to all of the points you raised, or it is difficult to answer to all of the points you raised. So I thought instead of answering and responding to these questions directly, I would try to bring some of the key ideas from all the interventions together and summarize them. So the first one, I think, that was raised several times is the question of how do we know that this experimental practice, this alterontological practice, alterontologies, or the spaces that modern social movements create provide an alternative and are not co-opted or captured or recaptured. And I think this is an important question because it is about social movements and because it is about social transformation we expect we expect and we want social movements to contribute to social transformation in ways that are not happening through mainstream political pathways. So we need to have a feeling that there is something happening that creates an alternative when we engage in these practices. I personally find this also an important question and a difficult one to answer, because the possibility that we would have in order to understand whether we are doing transformative politics, in whichever way we do it, would be to have to create a normative outside and then judge transformation against the practice of social movements. Let's say we create an eco-village, and then we have a normative understanding of what we should understand as environmental change in terms of pollution, waste, water treatment, or use of resources, supplies, emissions, and so on. And then we judge the social transformation that is happening in this concrete, specific experiment against this. Now, this might be necessary for certain forms of practice, and I am involved also in parts of technoscience that do that. We have life cycle assessments, we have different forms of environmental metrics, we have different forms to judge the trace that we leave on ecosystems and so on, and that's important in specific fields. But now for social movements, I would struggle to think that we would need to have something that would, in normative ways, define what is a transformative outcome. But then we are left with a question: what is a transformative outcome of social movement action, or more than social movement action? And I think here, at least experimental practice, the book tries to approach this through the question of justice, and a question of justice as a form of material economy, economy as not economics, but with reference to the moral economy. So we have in certain contexts a form of experiential sense of what a moral economy, a material economy is, and how it should be sustained. And many of these movements rely on these accumulated knowledges that have been handed over other social movements or other practitioners or other organizations that think and create knowledge about specific context. So they rely on these knowledges in order to evaluate their own practice. So instead of creating something, a normative understanding of what more than social movement action is and how we can evaluate it, the book tries to take into account that there is always something that we bring with us when we engage in social movement action. So there are long history lines, there are storylines, there are traditional knowledge systems, there are practitioners that offer lots of inspiration, practice, knowledge that give us the opportunity to think if something that we are doing is transformative or not, and if it goes to the right direction or not. I think it's a very difficult point. It's the most difficult of all because it's I would want to resist a question which would come: what is the big system to evaluate this movement? What are the normative principles? How do we know if we are moving forwards or backwards? How do we know if there is change or there is not change? And this is related to many of the questions that some of you raised. So, for example, Anthropocene, or perhaps I'll start. Laura asked about the anthropological presuppositions of experimental practice. And then I think Lara asked about what is the bigger understanding of the, let's say, the cultural, social, economic conditions, why there is not a reference to capitalism in experimental practice as such, or how would we stand with the big narratives like Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Tulocene, and whichever approach we would take. I think Luigi also asked about the same question. It can be appropriating, it can be neoliberal, it can be recaptured. So what is the bigger understanding of the context, the bigger context that we have within experimental practice? Now, within the book, I try to resist to my own tendency to put a name to this context for different reasons. I think I resisted the understanding of capital as a narrative of capitalism, as a narrative of explanation, simply because it orders the logic of who acts in history. So if I would put capitalism as a key concept in this in this movement, in the conditions in which the social movements operate, then I would have to analyze again the relation between labor and capital, and then this would be possibly and necessarily become a dominating relation. So I would have to superimpose a capitalist relation over other forms of exploitation or other forms of social relations that happens, for example, ecological relations or more than human relations or gender relations or post-colonial, decolonial relations. There is a lot of discussion, of course, about all this, but I wanted to avoid an explanation that would pose as the driving force of historical social movement change a clash between I don't know, movements that engage against capital, not or capitalism. Not that this shouldn't happen or this doesn't happen. In fact, most of these movements do that. But I would say that they do that as part of another practice, that it is the practice of the creation of material, ecological alternatives, rather than creating a different economic model. Of course, many of these are connected and economic models are part of this. But I would think that there is a question there, what we put. The same is with Anthropocene. Anthropocene would create again an overarching principle of putting humans in charge of creating solutions for a problem that humans have created. So, and I think concepts do things, and I think the Anthropocene concept does important things, actually. And I wouldn't try to dismiss it. Many people do it, or to offer very quickly an alternative, I'm happy that it is there and does the work that it does. For certain groups, for certain people in the sciences, in some sciences, but for more than social movements, I wouldn't want to pose the anthropos, the human, as the one who is in charge in delivering, in creating first the problem and in delivering the solution to the problem. So such a big narrative would create an imbalance in the same way that a narrative of capitalism would create an imbalance in this practice towards an overarching explanation through the conflict of living labor. So now, if we leave, that's why they are not there, these narratives. But of course, then we have the problem, and this is something that many of you raised. We have the problem of scale, and we have the problem of how do we think, why is more than social movement experimental practices transformative, and can we replicate them? Can we have more of them? Can we use them in order to counteract to what we see as ecological or social destruction that is happening today? Can we develop an alternative? I found it difficult to unify them, to bring them together, to bring them together as something that has one core essence that is scalable. And in discussions about scale, and I think in science and technology studies, there are very important discussions about scale. In discussions about scale, there are some people, Meryl Strathen, for example, that would say scale does not really exist. It never existed. There is not such thing as scale, because different qualities that you find in one scale, you find them in also bigger scales. So instead of having scales that include others and include others, so nested, instead of having nested scales, we have fractal environment that cut through the scale and have qualities from all these different scales. So for Meryl Strathen, I think, I'm not sure, but I think he would say that there is no such thing of a scale. Other people, Anna Tsing, for example, would say scale is the problem. Scale is a problem because whenever you have scale, you have distraction, and I think she uses plantation, Anna Tsing, as the model of scale. So she says the plantation is essentially an understanding of scalability that brought distraction to the world. And whenever we think and engage in practice of scale, we replicate something that has some is destructive. I think all of these discussions about scale are valid, and I think the other discussions that I experience now, for example, in my project in chemicals, and Luigi mentioned that we need to have some understanding of scale in order to be able to approach this politics. So in my work in chemistry, a lot of the people think that if we are to develop alternative benign chemicals to replace all these toxic polluting substance chemicals that we have, we need to achieve some scale. Otherwise, we will never be able to replace the amount of substances that are out there that have negative effects on our lives and the environment. So scale for them is a necessity. Without scale, we cannot achieve change. So I'm saying there are all these many approaches and definitions and what scale is. For me, it became very clearly, and I would agree here with what many of you said, the financial crisis and the problems that it brought for so many people, including, for example, my mom, who found herself again being in a new poverty. So, and then it happens again with COVID. So in the beginning of COVID and the pandemic, we were thinking that there might be alternatives. We might think growth, development. We might be able to rethink many of the stuff that we want to reduce in order to reduce our footprint, in order to reduce the effects that it has on our lives and on the planet, in order to slow down, to minimize traces and footprint. But clearly it became that this enforced reduced growth has devastating effect for many who never were the big participants of growth, for those for big populations that have never actually profited from the enormous growth, both within global north societies and outside. The effects are devastating. So we have new waves of new poverty, new destruction, new exclusion, new discriminations, new political unrest, and so on. I'm saying that because I think the question of scale is a question I'm struggling also with, and I think I would disagree with those who would say we don't need a form of scale without being able to offer a model of scalability of alterontological practices that are transformative. What I know, though, and what I would take in the book as a starting point, and that's why I decided to call it Baroque fieldworking, is that there are many practices that rely on what I said in the beginning, that they don't have a normative concept of understanding of social transformation, but rely on all these knowledge and experiences that are given through social movements to other social movements in order to create grounded, situated social transformation. So there is not one way to bring all these movements together. I personally wouldn't want to find one, and I don't think that there is a way to create a model of scalability for them. On the other hand, there is a sense of reproducibility of social ecological transformation in many of these movements, if you think them together. Permaculture, ecological villages, alternative production systems, agroecology, seed banking, and then new production and distribution networks of products, questions about labor and exchange, and then developing alternative models of exchange based on these new practices. All these together, they don't constitute a normative concept of how food, for example, is produced, but they constitute a felt alternative on the ground of many of these communities. Now, of course, there is the question, is this enough to counterbalance or to counteract, if you want something stronger, neoliberalism? No, it is not. But I would find it very, very difficult to devalue more than social movement action because of the absence of this bigger narrative of a bigger social transformation. I think it is important that this social transformation happens in many different ways, localized and transformative, without necessarily coming into this narrative, and is given from one example to the next. Is the generosity of these infrastructures that is mentioned in the book, is given from one context to the next. It is taken, it is modified, it is reapplied, it is remodified, and so on. And I want to come here, and perhaps this is the last point, the material spirituality. This is Maria's concept. Maria is, I think, I don't know if you're here, Maria. I think you are. So you might want to say something about this. This is Maria's concept, and for me, I took it because I want to describe that when you are engaging in the process of material transformation, you rely on something that it is bigger than you as a community, for example. There is a lot of moral values, ideas, practices, technologies, objects, experiences that come through us and are given to us from others who are practicing similar systems out there, or similar transformations, or similar experimental, create similar experimental practices. And we take many of them and we work on them and we give them further. And I think more than social movements work like that. And social movements, I try to work with the example of migration, in many ways have worked with that. There was never a final normative understanding of what is right and wrong for transmigrants. There was not. Of course, if you change the perspective and move on the other side and think not of social movement action and politics, but of mainstream instituted politics, then you have a different view, and this is a valid and necessary view. But if you take, as we do now, the social movement action, then it was much more the transformational politics rely on these long histories that are given to us, and we give them further through our actions. And what I try to bring in is that a lot of this, perhaps now, today, because we are facing a socio-ecological crisis of a magnitude that we didn't know that we are facing, at least I didn't know 20 or 30 years ago, in the same scale, we need to think them as material practices. What we make and what we give further is also material practices, are stories of objects, are stories of creation, of creativity. Of course, all of this can be co-opted and is constantly co-opted, and it was never, I think there was never in social movement action a sense of purity. And there was also never a quest for purity in social movement action. It was always about making a difference through social transformation, and what new social movements or prefigurative movements or more than social movements, the term doesn't matter. So whatever the term, these movements add something that we need, as a matter of necessity, need to engage with with material transformation. So I think that's what this brings, is that is less about purity and avoiding appropriation, and is about making difference in material terms. And making a difference in material terms is, when you don't follow instituted path, is quite difficult. And despite being difficult, I would say that there is a plethora of social movements and not grand social movements, but many social movements materializing these alternatives. So it's both. We are in a very discouraging moment, I think, and on the other hand, we are also in a moment where this creativity oscillates between co-option, as many of you said, co-option, and then excess. And this excess is what we can build on from a social movement perspective, in order to keep this transformative politics in action. Yeah, I think there are, of course, many aesthetics, politics, the question of care, the question of ethnography. There are a lot of points that you have raised. Now I cannot go on because I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So these are some thoughts. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitris. So we have time. So the discussion is completely open. So feel free to intervene immediately if you want, for comments, questions.
If nobody is advancing a question, then I take a little bit more of time to reply to Dimitris' generous answer to the comments. Thank you very much. I fully agree about the fact that proposing a normative, overarching and normative framework within which to judge bad or a good transformation is not anymore a viable solution. I mean, it's very difficult to say what is good, what is bad, and at least on a very general level, each of us personally might take this choice to judge, but as social scientists, it's really hard to propose what it is. But that's why, exactly why I stress so much on ethnography, because as you said, you prefer to rely on the specific and localized articulations on on transformation. And so that's why I think it's so vital for us to give as much as details of what is happening there at that specific time, what are the entanglements. And because what we can do as social scientists, I think, is not to give normative and overarching frameworks, but to offer a repertoire of what is happening and which are the consequences. And so others might be able, maybe if they want, to judge and decide what is good or what is bad. So this is how I see. But thanks. Is how I see, but I couldn't see before you gave me your comment.
I agree, and many of you. So Laura mentioned the importance of ethnography, and I think Naomi and Lara and you, and how it is crucial And I felt, so an anecdote of the book is that when it went to the reviewers of there was a sense, is this an ethnographic book or not? There was in the reviews. So, well, I'm not an ethnographer, but I'm a field worker. So I do field work, and all, like not in this book, from all the books and all the projects that I've been doing are part of field work, and a field work that is in most cases a committed field work. So as an active practitioner of within the fields I'm working. But I would struggle to call myself an ethnographer in this sense. And I think it's a valid point, and many of you raised a valid point, and it's interesting that it was raised also by the reviewers of the book. So do we need more is it theory? Is it ethnography? Is it cultural studies? What is this? I personally don't have an answer. I know that it's not ethnography in the classical way, and I know that it is not theory, because my questions are driven through, emerged through my fieldwork, emerged through this intimate engagement with realities and the realities of social movements, and in most of them I am in some way or another part of. So I see the point that more ethnographic material is needed generally, but I would want also to keep it open for people to find expressions of contribution to this type of, let's say, modern social movements or social movement action or community technoscience, or however we call it, through many other pathways. I think conceptual theoretical pathways can be equal. So that's why I ended up thinking that I cannot call this an ethnography, although I did a lot of field work. And I thought it's something of Baroque fieldworking. You do an ethnography, but this doesn't mean that you stay close to the materials and have only an ethnographic reading of them. Then you do this work and you create all these Baroque worlds out of them, or they are created through your field work. And this is what is Baroque field working, as opposed to a more traditional understanding of ethnography that stays close. I don't want to juxtapose them as one is better than the other. I want to say that I wasn't confident enough to say I'm doing an ethnography, I'm an ethnographer, I will write ethnographically in the book. So I found an escape route of this, which is keep a lot of this ethnographic sensibility, but within a context that involves many other things, you know, histories, visual, the visual aspect was crucial, popular culture, films, practices, and so on, objects, materials. So, yeah, my response is, it's important, I agree, but I would like to keep it open for other ways of expression, not just experimental practice, not that the book, to come in and contribute to this thing that many of us are trying to create.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. You went to the core of the current discussions and debate within anthropology about what is ethnography, you know, starting from Tim Ingold, that's enough with ethnography and many others, but I don't want to take too much time, but thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll take 1 minute for remember everybody that the next number of Technoscience is the Italian journal. It's the Italian journal of the science, the STS community. And we lost a section on crossing boundaries, and we lost a discussion on the book of Dimitris. So, and in the next conference, in the next Italian STS conference in Trieste, in the next summer, Dimitris Papadopoulos will be the keynote speaker of the event, one of the keynote speakers of the event. So we will have soon other good chance for staying in touch and discussing Dimitris' work. Okay, Maria. So if there are other intervention,
I think so, Andrea. One hand was raised. Manuela, if I saw that correctly.
Great, thank you.
If that was intentional, though. Apparently not. Yes,
there are
but
some comments on the chat.
Then we have another one now. Right, Pietro? Is that possible?
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Hi. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Dimitris, in particular. I must say I am really excited about today and about then also your participation in the as a keynote speaker to the upcoming conference. So thank you very much. I have another question following your latest intervention on the more methodological debate that your speech and your book have raised. In particular, I think that a very interesting term that you came up with in your book has not emerged yet today, that is social science fiction, or forgive me if that has come up and I missed it. Maybe you could say another few words about that. I would be really happy, also because I have the feeling, having read your book extensively over the past few years, over and over again, I had a similar feeling that I had when reading Anna Singh's book on the mushroom. It's a book that is trying to elaborate also a new genre somehow. I had this feeling, which is then also troubling students and younger scholars, because then we somehow want to try to replicate sometimes or get inspired deeply by the things we read. At least this is the case for my experience of reading and then writing and field working and so on. So like in Anna Singh, I opened the book and I just read, and I had the same feeling with you. And yeah, well, just congratulations, really. It's really inspiring. And
thank you.
Now, Manuela. Okay, try to speak, Manuela, please. Could you listen to me? Okay. Okay, sorry.
She says it seems it doesn't work. So
Okay.
she's trying to log in again. If we have different questions, we can move on. If not, I don't know. I don't envy the chair in these situations.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Oh, sorry, Dimitris, before I interrupted you, would like to say something, please do it, and we are waiting for Manuela.
Yes, Manuela is here.
No, she is. Okay, Dimitri, if you have something to say.
I just want to say that in response to Pietro about social science fiction, which is a similar technique of engaging with this multiplicity of materials that we find when we do field work in these spaces. I see many people, more and more people doing this kind of work. So I see more and more creative writing inspiring people to do social science analysis and social science research. And again, I wouldn't want to say that this is the way forward. I think there are many ways, and all of them contribute in creating an understanding of this experimental practice that is necessary. But I want to say that social science fiction, which was not in our radars before, I think is much more there. And together with it, for example, visual ways of visual and graphic ways of storytelling of social analysis. This is coming also in as part of writing social science and doing social science analysis in many alternative ways. So of course, social science fiction is probably the most demanding of all, because it requires that you have skills of writing fiction and doing social science at the same time, which is very, very, very difficult to do. But despite that, there are many people who try to do that, and I think it's this openness in the way we work with materials is very interesting. So yeah.
If you're still waiting for Manuel, I just say one word.
Okay.
If I can. Now, about what Dimitris was saying in his comments, as he replied to comments about neoliberalism, whatever, because my feeling is that there are the tendency to go to two extremes. So one, say, there are books and articles that are overwhelmed by the problem of capitalism and new materialism. So it seems something that is so overarching, overwhelming, that you have just to react and deal with it. And others are totally ignore capitalism, whatever. I would just say a name, Latour. You never see the word capitalism in Latour's writings. So this is these two extremes. My feeling is that we should find a kind of balance in the sense that to be aware that the very notion and concept that we are using, including Alterontologies, as I say in my view, is the product of the particular historical moment in which we live. And only in this way we can raise a meaningful critique, whether discursive or embodied or practical or whatever. So only from the very standpoint that we live, once we get some kind of awareness of the specificity or the particularities of the moment in which we live. So it's a kind of what Foucault called the immanent critique. So a critique raised not from a point from nowhere, a look from nowhere, but from the historical moment in which we live. So we have to deal with capitalism and neoliberalism without letting us to be totally absorbed by the issue, but also not going like Latour, who carefully avoids any tiny reference to capitalism or whatever, because it's really a little bit ridiculous in my view. Okay.
Manuela, we try again.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Oh. Yeah, we can.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I think I'm on a slightly slower computer now, but it's also not such a great question that it merits all this waiting. I'm not sure. It's just a small little question.
It's good to see you, Manuela, though.
Yes, it's very nice to see you too. Thanks very much for this. I'm very, very inspired. And I have to admit, I haven't read the book, so I hope it's okay to kind of come with a question from a very different place.
You know, most of us comment on books that we haven't read.
Yes. I will not comment on the book anyways. I'm too tired for that because it's a bit intense in Vienna right now, as you can imagine. I was very, yeah, it's very useful. I find all these reflections that you had about normativity, and it made me think a lot about how neoliberal governance somehow keeps demanding normativity of different kind of projects, thinking about commoning practices, for instance, but how I've been now involved in as a postdoc in a project looking at commons in Southern Europe for the last 3 years. It just finished, and I looked also a little bit at municipalism. And you know, since the 15M movement in Spain, maybe other people want to open to this, but there was this demand, you know, you're out in the streets, what do you do? You know, if this is not translatable into policy or into politics, it's kind of worth nothing. So there is this kind of demand for normativity from social movements often. And then I was thinking, you know, very interesting things developed out of this demand in some extent also. The new municipalisms in Spain and so on, they've done a lot of really good work, and they work with care in really interesting ways, at least in Barcelona and some other places. But then what happens with the rest somehow of that social movement? I'm still with social movements here, but just bear with me somehow. So I was just thinking somehow, you know, it's okay that movements are demanded, are kind of institutionalized and become normative in some sense, but I really liked what you say about the fact that that's not the only way of thinking about reproducibility, or that things can be reproduced in other ways beyond just a normative framework. You know, in the case of the common study, I've just constantly faced these questions. You know, you look at Ostrom's criteria and so on, and you know, everything is to be put into a box, and this is the only way we can understand this practice, and so much gets lost, obviously. So I was just wondering about this question of reproducibility, how you think about that, and sorry if there's a chapter on it in the book that I don't know about, because it's like, what or how is reproduction if it isn't just replication or something like this? And this brought me obviously to think about care, because care and reproduction are very close to one another. And